There is a cartoon that knew exactly what it was doing from the very first episode. Adventure Time ran for 10 seasons on Cartoon Network, from 2010 to 2018. And in that time, it produced a specific handful of episodes that people carry with them the way you carry certain songs. Not because they were the loudest or the most dramatic, but because they arrived at exactly the right moment and left something behind that did not go away. Tonight, we are moving slowly through the most iconic of them. The ones that changed what the show was. The ones that people mean when they say Adventure Time was more than it looked like. The stories inside them, the feelings they left behind, and the quiet way they opened something up in whoever was watching. Some of them are funny, some of them are not. All of them are true in the way the best episodes of this show were always true. Welcome to Jacko. Let's get started. The world that was already gone. The land of Ooo does not look like the ruins of anything. That is the first thing the show wants you to believe, and it is very good at making you believe it. The grass is green. The Candy Kingdom is pink and cheerful and staffed entirely by citizens made of sweets. The sky is blue in the way that cartoon skies are blue, saturated and clean and uncomplicated. Finn and Jake live in a treehouse and they go on adventures, and they come home and everything is generally fine. The show arrives in your living room in 2010 looking like a particularly colorful piece of children's fantasy, the kind where the world was always magical, always populated by talking creatures and friendly kingdoms, always fundamentally safe in the way that fantasy worlds are built to be safe. But the ruins are there from the very beginning. You have to know to look for them. In the background of early episodes, almost never commented on by any character, there are vehicles that do not belong in a fantasy world. Rusted military shapes half buried in the earth, their outlines softened by decades of overgrowth but unmistakably mechanical. Unmistakably from somewhere and some time that had factories and armies and the industrial capacity to produce that kind of hardware. There are buildings too, or what used to be buildings. Their walls cracked and their roofs long gone, their architectural bones recognizable as something from the world the audience lives in, rather than anything a fantasy kingdom would construct. The show plants these details in the peripheral vision of the viewing experience, and then keeps moving. It does not stop to explain them. It does not circle back and underline their significance. It puts them there, in the background of an episode about Jake turning into a balloon, or Finn trying to learn a new sword technique, and trusts that whoever is paying close enough attention will feel the weight of them, even without understanding exactly what they mean. Pendleton Ward, the show's creator, talked about this approach in several interviews during the early seasons. He wanted the post-apocalyptic elements to be present without raising eyebrows. Cars buried underground in the background, ruins that read as generic landscape detail rather than as the specific aftermath of a specific catastrophe. The goal was never to make a child watching a Saturday morning cartoon think consciously about nuclear war. The goal was to give the world a density and a history, to make it feel like a place that had been through things rather than a place that had simply been assembled for the purpose of having adventures inside it. The darkness was atmospheric. It was texture. It was the difference between a world that felt earned and a world that felt constructed. And Ward was building something he wanted to feel earned. The opening credits of the show are 32 seconds long. They pan across the land of Ooo while a short, simple song plays. Bright and bouncy and immediately memorable. It became one of the most recognized pieces of animation music of the 2000s and 10s. Most viewers watched it hundreds of times without stopping to notice what appears in the very first seconds, before the pan moves to the cheerful landscape. There are broken weapons in the grass. Not decorative fantasy weapons. Not the kind of prop that a medieval adventure story would scatter around for atmosphere. Broken, rusted shapes that have been there long enough to have been partially swallowed by the earth. The same way the military vehicles in the background of episodes have been partially swallowed. The opening credits are 32 seconds of pleasant music over buried destruction. And that contrast, upbeat melody over ruins, is the entire philosophy of how Adventure Time handled its darkness in its early seasons. The darkness was always there. The show just kept playing the song. The episode that made the show's post-apocalyptic nature something the writers explicitly committed to, rather than hinted at, arrived 8th in the first season. It is called Business Time. Finn and Jake are melting icebergs in a lake, collecting materials for a dock they want to build, and in one of the icebergs they find 4 men in business suits who have been frozen for a very long time. The men are not magical creatures. They are not monsters or demons or anything that belongs in a fantasy world. They are, unmistakably, office workers from the world the audience recognizes. They wear ties. They have briefcases. They speak in the clipped, efficiency-focused language of people who spent their working lives in corporate environments. They have been in the ice for approximately 1,000 years and they cannot remember anything about who they were or how they got there. And so they do what they know how to do, which is work. And the episode uses their presence primarily for comedy about the nature of productivity and delegation. But underneath the comedy, those men are fossils. They are physical evidence of a civilization that no longer exists, preserved in ice for a millennium, thawed out in a world that has no place for them and no memory of the one they came from. Pendleton Ward has said in interviews that Business Time was the episode where the writing writing staff definitively decided that the land of Ooo was post-apocalyptic. The background details that had seemed like visual flavor suddenly had a logic to them. The ruins were ruins. The buried vehicles were buried vehicles. The world was the ruins of our world, and the decision to commit to that premise was made in the middle of producing the first season rather than before it began, which means the show's most foundational piece of lore was not planned from the first day. It grew from a single image, 4 businessmen in ice, that the writers recognized as something too important to let pass. Ward described his influences for the show's visual aesthetic in a way that clarifies exactly what he was reaching for. He cited the Mad Max franchise as the inspiration for the post-apocalyptic layer of Adventure Time's world. Mad Max is not a gentle reference. It is a series of films about what survives after civilization collapses, about the specific brutality and strangeness of a world that has stopped maintaining itself. Ward was not hiding the darkness of his setting in the sense of being embarrassed by it or uncertain about it. He was embedding it so thoroughly into the visual background that a viewer could choose to see it or choose to enjoy the surface without the choice ever being forced. The Mad Max ruins were present in every establishing shot. The cheerful adventure was present in every piece of dialogue. The show held both simultaneously and asked each viewer to find their own depth. There is a Season 2 episode called Video Makers, where Finn and Jake discover old videotapes with government copyright warnings on them, the kind that played at the beginning of VHS recordings in the real world for decades, warning viewers about illegal copying and reproduction. The joke is that Finn and Jake take the warnings completely seriously, treating legal instructions from a government that has not existed for 1,000 years as current and binding. The comedy comes from their earnestness, but the thing underneath the comedy is that those warnings are artifacts. They are the recorded voice of a civilization speaking into a future it could not have imagined, still giving instructions to people who have no way of knowing what the instructions were ever for. The humor and the melancholy are not separate things in that moment. They are the same thing, which is how Adventure Time operated at its best, finding the place where something could be funny and haunting simultaneously and staying there. What the show was building in its early seasons, across all of these background details and throwaway lines, and carefully placed relics of the old world, was a foundation. Not a foundation the audience was meant to consciously recognize and analyze in real time, but a foundation they were meant to absorb, the way you absorb the texture of a place when you spend a lot of time inside it. By the time Adventure Time started being direct about what had happened to the world before Ooo, the audience had already spent seasons living in the aftermath without fully knowing what they were living in. The revelation did not feel like new information when it finally arrived more explicitly. It felt like the name for something they had already been feeling. That is the particular genius of how the show was structured. And it was not accidental. Ward wanted to make the kind of show that rewarded the people who paid close attention with something the casual viewer could walk past. He has talked about freeze-framing The Simpsons as a child to find background jokes nobody was supposed to catch, and about wanting to build something with that same quality, something that had more inside it than its surface suggested, something that gave back more the more you looked. The ruins in the background of Adventure Time are the clearest expression of that intention. They are there for whoever wants to find them. The show keeps moving either way. The creative team that built those early seasons was full of people who brought their own specific sensibilities to the texture Ward was creating. Rebecca Sugar, who would go on to create Steven Universe, was writing and storyboarding episodes in the early seasons and pushing the show toward emotional depth from the inside. Patrick McHale, who later created Over the Garden Wall, contributed a particular quality of melancholy and visual strangeness to his episodes that deepened the show's atmosphere in ways that individual episode credits do not fully capture. These were not people who were making a simple children's cartoon and happened to include some interesting background details. They were people who were genuinely interested in the complexity the show could contain, and they built that complexity into the foundations before the audience had any way of knowing how much weight those foundations would eventually need to carry. The land of Ooo, by the end of the show's run, would be understood as a place that had been built on the wreckage of a nuclear war. The Candy Kingdom would be understood as a structure erected above a pond of radioactive waste, its cheerful citizens created from the contamination of the old world. Finn, the last human, would be understood as the remnant of a species that had nearly destroyed itself and left this one earnest boy in the wilderness. The magic that filled the world would be understood as a consequence of nuclear fallout transforming what was left. All of that was present in the earliest episodes, encoded into the backgrounds of shots, waiting. The show that looked like a silly cartoon about a kid and his magic dog was, from the first morning it ever aired, a story about what grows in the aftermath of catastrophe. It just had the patience to let you discover that slowly, at whatever depth you were ready to go. If you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The world that looked like a fantasy kingdom was always sitting on top of something that destroyed itself, and the next section section goes directly into what that something was, how it happened, and what it left behind. Section 2. The Mushroom War. What happened before Ooo? To understand what the land of Ooo actually is, you have to understand what it replaced. The cheerful fantasy world that Finn and Jake run through, with its candy kingdoms and cloud kingdoms and fire kingdoms and all the strange and colorful life that fills every corner of it, did not arrive from nowhere. It did not spring into existence as a magical realm always populated by talking creatures and friendly royalty and 11-minute adventures with soft resolutions. It grew from something. And what it grew from was the end of the world as the audience knows it, a global nuclear exchange that the show calls, with a quietness that is itself a kind of restraint, the Mushroom War. The name does the work without announcing that it is doing it. A mushroom is a natural thing, something that grows in damp and dark places, something associated with forests and fairy tales and the gentle strangeness of the natural world. It is also the shape of a nuclear explosion at the moment of detonation, the specific billowing column of smoke and heat and destruction that has been photographed and filmed enough times to become one of the most recognizable images of the 20th century. The show calls its apocalypse the Mushroom War and never explains the name. It does not need to. The name carries both meanings simultaneously and leaves the viewer to feel the gap between them, the gap between the soft, natural thing and the catastrophic human thing, which is exactly the gap the show lived in across its entire run. The Mushroom War was a nuclear conflict. It ended human civilization. It happened approximately 1,000 years before the events of the main series, in the late 20th or early 21st century, which the show establishes through scattered and carefully placed details rather than through any direct statement. Simon Petrikov, in the season 5 episode Simon and Marcy, references the television sitcom Cheers while trying to hold on to his sense of self in the ruins of the post-war world. Cheers premiered in 1982, which places the Mushroom War after that year. Other episodes show technology consistent with the late 1990s or early 2000s in the pre-war flashback sequences. A Generation 3 iMac visible in one scene. The visual language of late 20th century consumer electronics present in the scattered wreckage that Simon and young Marceline move through in the immediate aftermath. The show never gives a precise date. It gives enough details that a viewer paying close attention can arrive at a rough window, and then it keeps moving. What the war produced in the immediate sense was almost total human extinction. The exchange of nuclear weapons on whatever scale the Mushroom War involved killed the vast majority of the human population of the planet. The survivors who remained in the years immediately following were isolated and scattered, cut off from the infrastructure and supply chains and social organization that made sustained human life possible. They were hunted by hostile mutant creatures that the radiation and whatever other forces the bombs released had begun producing from what was left. There was almost nothing. The world the show's audience recognizes, the world of cities and governments and grocery stores and television, and all the accumulated structure of human civilization was simply gone. The buildings were still standing in places, or partially standing, their shapes preserved long enough to be haunting before the decades finished collapsing them. But the people who had built them and lived in them and maintained them were mostly dead, and the ones who were not were doing whatever they could to stay alive in whatever piece of the wreckage they happened to find themselves in. The land of Ooo is what grew in the 1,000 years following that. Not immediately, not in any organized or intentional way at first, but gradually, through whatever transformation nuclear fallout and the strange new forces released by the war worked on the biological material that remained. Animals mutated, plants mutated. Whatever latent magical potential existed in the world was unlocked or amplified by the conditions the war created. And over centuries, something entirely new began developing in the space where civilization had been. The candy and the magic and the strange new kingdoms, with their talking citizens and their elaborate social structures, are not ancient. They are new. They are 1,000 years old at most, which, in geological terms, is nothing, which in terms of lived experience is everything, which means that every character in the show is living in something that has barely had time to set. The show reveals all of this the way you learn a family secret, which is in pieces, over a long time, from different sources, with each piece arriving in a context that makes it land differently than it would have if you had been told everything at once. There is no single episode in the early seasons where a character sits down and explains the Mushroom War in clear and sequential terms. Instead, there are glimpses. There is the vocabulary of the old world appearing in strange places. There are artifacts that could not exist in a genuine fantasy realm. There are characters who have lived long enough to remember something of what came before, speaking about it in the specific shorthand of people describing ancient history, the kind of shorthand that assumes you already know the broad shape of things and are only filling in a detail or two. The physical evidence of the Mushroom War is present throughout the show's landscape in ways that become more visible the longer you watch. The rusted military vehicles in the backgrounds of establishing shots are not random. They are the equipment of an army, abandoned when the army stopped existing, left where they were because because there was no longer anyone to move them, or any reason to. The crumbled building facades that Finn and Jake run past in episodes set in the more desolate regions of Ooo have a specific architectural style, a mid-century human construction that no magical kingdom would have produced, and no fantasy world would have inherited. They are the bones of the old world, visible in the landscape of the new one, slowly being reclaimed by whatever is growing to replace them. There is a detail about the Candy Kingdom specifically that the show reveals across several episodes, and that changes how the entire location feels once it is understood. Princess Bubblegum did not discover the Candy Kingdom. She built it. She created the Candy People from materials she had available in the aftermath of the war, assembling citizens from whatever she could work with, building a kingdom to give herself and others something to live inside, rather than just survive inside. The show reveals in a Season 5 episode called The Vault that the site where the Candy Kingdom was built is directly above a pond of radioactive waste, nuclear contamination left over from the Mushroom War, sealed beneath the cheerful pink architecture of the castle and its grounds. The citizens of the Candy Kingdom, the gumdrops and marshmallows and wrapped sweets, who go about their daily lives with the straightforward happiness of people who have never had reason to question where they came from, were created from the transformed material of that contamination. The most cheerful location in the show is built on something that would kill a person. The most beloved community in Ooo was assembled from the residue of the thing that destroyed the world that came before it. The show does not stop to point this out. It reveals it in the course of a larger episode about one of Finn's past lives, and then it keeps moving, and the audience has to decide what to do with the information in the space the show does not provide for processing it. That restraint is consistent across everything the Mushroom War touches. The show is not interested in making the audience feel bad about the apocalypse in a sustained or belabored way. It is interested in the apocalypse being true, in it being real and present and woven into the fabric of every cheerful thing the show contains, so that the cheerfulness carries weight it would not carry if it had simply appeared from nowhere. Ward's stated intention across multiple interviews was to limit the post-apocalyptic elements to things that do not raise eyebrows. He wanted the ruins to feel like background rather than foreground, to function as texture rather than as the dominant emotional register of any given episode. And for the most part, across the first several seasons, that restraint held. The Mushroom War was present in the way that history is present in a place that has been through things. Visible if you look for it, easy to miss if you are not looking. It was the foundation, and the show built its bright and colorful superstructure on top of it, and trusted the foundation to do its work without constantly drawing attention to itself. What changed across the middle seasons was that the show began introducing characters and episodes that brought the Mushroom War closer to the surface. Not by explaining it more completely, or by making it the explicit subject of episodes, but by showing its human consequences. By making the abstract history of a nuclear war into something with specific faces and specific losses attached to it. The businessmen in the iceberg were the first version of this, but they were comic and distanced, their humanity softened by the joke the episode built around them. What came later was not softened at all. The episode that brought the Mushroom War into genuine emotional proximity for most viewers was the Season 5 episode Simon and Marcy, which showed Simon Petrikov and a young Marceline navigating the post-war ruins in the immediate years following the conflict. The world they moved through was the actual aftermath, not ruins picturesque enough to read as fantasy landscape, but the specific desolation of a city that had been functioning and then stopped, its streets empty, its buildings partially standing in the specific way of structures that were built to last and were then subjected to forces they were not built to survive. The color palette of those sequences was deliberately drained of the show's usual vibrancy. The character designers and background artists pulled the saturation down and pushed the palette toward dust and gray, so that the visual language of the post-war world was immediately distinguishable from the bright ooh that the show spent most of its time inside. The difference in how those scenes looked communicated, before any dialogue, that this was a harder and more dangerous place than the one the audience was used to. The Adventure Time team, when pitching Simon and Marcy to Cartoon Network's network executives, described it with a single film reference. They called it The Road, except for kids. The Road is Cormac McCarthy's novel and subsequent film about a man and his young son moving through a world in which all life has essentially ended. It is one of the bleaker pieces of storytelling produced in the first decade of the 2000s, a book that does not relent and does not offer easy comfort, and is not interested in resolution so much as in the specific texture of trying to keep going when keeping going is genuinely difficult. That was the model the Adventure Time writers used for a children's cartoon episode, not because they wanted to traumatize their audience, but because they were taking seriously what it would actually have been like to be alive in the immediate aftermath of the Mushroom War, and taking it seriously meant not softening it into something that did not feel true. Cartoon Network pushed back on elements of the episode during development. One of the most significant changes forced by the network network involved what Simon was actually searching for. In earlier versions of the script, Simon was looking for medicine for the fever Marceline had developed in the cold and damp of the post-war ruins. The network determined that the unavailability of medicine in a destroyed world was too dark a concept for the show's audience. The writers changed the object of the search to soup, chicken soup. Simon spent the episode looking for chicken soup for a sick child in the ruins of a city that had recently been destroyed by nuclear war, and the bones of the story remained exactly what they had always been, while the surface object became something softer. The network accepted it. The episode aired, and what audiences saw was a man and a child alone in the ruins of everything, trying to find something warm to eat, which is both completely gentle in its specifics and completely devastating in its implications. The physical details of the post-war world as depicted in Simon and Marcy deserve to be dwelt on for a moment, because the show's art direction in those sequences was doing specific and deliberate work. The streets Simon and Marceline moved through were empty in a way that animated backgrounds almost never are. Adventure Time's OO is usually dense with life, full of background characters and ambient movement and the general busy energy of a populated world. The post-war city was still. The stillness communicated something that a single destroyed building or a single visual indicator of catastrophe could not communicate on its own, which is the specific quality of a world that has not just been damaged, but emptied. The buildings were there, the streets were there, the infrastructure was there, or the remnants of it. The people were not, and the absence of people in a space built for people is its own form of horror, quieter, and in some ways more difficult to sit with than any direct image of destruction. Simon at one point finds a motorcycle in the ruins and tries to use it to move faster through the city with Marceline. They crash. He finds an office chair with wheels and pushes her through the empty streets instead, moving at walking pace through a city designed for cars and mass transit, and all the speed of a world that valued efficiency. The image of a man pushing a child in an office chair through a destroyed city is simultaneously absurd and tender, and quietly one of the most effective pieces of visual storytelling the show ever produced. He is using what is available. He is doing the best he can with what the world has left him. He is being loving and practical and slightly ridiculous in a situation that is genuinely terrible. And that combination, love and practicality and a touch of absurdity against a backdrop of genuine tragedy, is the show's most fundamental emotional register, stated as clearly as it was ever stated. The Mushroom War also produced The Lich, though the show reveals this across several episodes rather than in a single explanatory moment. The Lich's physical form emerged from the explosion of the mutagenic bomb that ended the war, shaped by the detonation itself into a body built from the energy of mass destruction. The most terrifying entity in the show's universe is not an alien force or a supernatural intruder. It is what humanity's capacity for self-destruction produced when that capacity was fully realized. Every time Finn and Jake face the Lich across the show's run, they are in the most literal possible sense fighting the consequence of the Mushroom War. The war never ended. It just took a different shape, gave itself a name, and kept going. What the show did with the Mushroom War, across 10 seasons of careful and unhurried revelation, was build a foundation for everything else. Every piece of darkness in Adventure Time, every loss and every grief, and every character shaped by forces outside their control, traces back eventually to what happened 1,000 years before the show began. Simon lost himself because of an artifact from a world the war unmade. Marceline survived it and carried the surviving of it for centuries. Princess Bubblegum built her kingdom from its residue. The Lich rose from its detonation. Even Finn, the earnest human boy who never knew the old world and has no way of mourning it, is the Mushroom War's most unlikely product. The one human child left in a world that barely has room for the concept of humanity anymore, going on adventures in the ruins of everything that made his species what it once was. The show never made you feel the weight of all of that at once. It parceled it out slowly across years, letting each piece settle before the next one arrived. And by the time the full picture was visible, the audience had been living inside it long enough that the recognition, when it came, felt less like learning something new and more like finally seeing clearly something that had always been there. If you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The Mushroom War built the world that OO grew from, and everything dark in the show traces back to what the bombs left behind. What arrived in Season 2 to remind the audience that some of what was left had not softened with time was a villain built from the detonation itself, and the show would never feel quite the same after he appeared. Section 3. The Lich, a villain with no jokes. Adventure Time spent its first season building a particular kind of threat. The Ice King was the primary antagonist of those early episodes, and he was an antagonist in the specific way that children's cartoons tend to produce antagonists, which is to say he was more irritating than dangerous, more pathetic than frightening, and more likely to fail in a way that was funny than to succeed in a way that cost anyone anything real. His schemes involved kidnapping princesses and attempting to force one into marrying carrying him, which was played for absurdity rather than menace. He was lonely and deluded, and his penguins waddled after him, and his ice magic was used primarily to create inconveniences rather than genuine harm. The show had established a tonal agreement with its audience across that first season, and the agreement said that threats in the land of Ooo were manageable, that danger had soft edges, that nothing here was permanent enough to be genuinely frightening. The agreement held for a full season, and then Adventure Time introduced the Lich, and everything that had been true about the show's relationship to danger stopped being true. The Lich is described in the show's original pitch Bible, the document Pendleton Ward created in 2007 to sell the series to networks, in language worth sitting with. Ward wrote, directly and without elaboration, that the Lich is not a wacky villain. That phrase, placed inside a pitch document for an animated children's series, is an instruction. It is Ward telling everyone who would ever work on this character that this particular creation was going to operate outside the tonal rules governing everything else. Do not soften him. Do not give him a comedic dimension. Do not let him have any quality that would allow the audience to find safe distance from what he represents. The show followed that instruction with a consistency remarkable across its entire run. He is voiced by Ron Perlman, whose casting was one of the most consequential creative decisions the show made in its early seasons. When the Lich speaks in Mortal Folly, the season 2 finale where he appears as a present and active threat for the first time, he does not give speeches or announce his intentions with theatrical villainy. He speaks quietly. He speaks directly. The gentleness of his address to Finn is the point. The show had given its most frightening entity the most controlled voice possible, and the control was more disturbing than any amount of theatrical menace would have been. The mechanism of the Lich's arrival is worth examining because it contains something true about how darkness travels. Throughout the first 2 seasons, a small snail appears in the background of every single episode, a beloved running joke that rewarded the show's most attentive viewers. Finding it became a game. It was harmless and charming, and in Mortal Folly, the snail is the mechanism by which the Lich frees himself from his amber prison. He possesses it. He uses it to break the seal. The show took its warmest signal to its most dedicated viewers and made it the vehicle for the arrival of genuine horror. The Lich did not come with fanfare. He came through a snail that everyone thought they knew. Mortal Folly was also the first episode where events carried directly and without resolution into the next installment, breaking the episodic structure the show had maintained across its entire first season. The Lich required 2 episodes, and even after both the resolution was incomplete, his spirit survived. He returned across subsequent seasons. He kept returning. He was the show's announcement that some things in Ooo did not resolve, that the tonal agreement the first season had established was being permanently revised. The Lich's stated purpose is not complicated. He does not want to rule Ooo or achieve any particular goal that would allow his story to resolve into success or failure. He wants everything that exists to stop existing. The show plays this completely straight, with no comedic undercut and no moment where the stated purpose reveals itself as a cover for something more comprehensible. The simplicity is more disturbing than any elaborate scheme would have been, because a villain with a plan can be countered with a better plan. The Lich did not have a plan. He had a direction, and the direction was the end of everything, and he had been moving in it for 1,000 years before Finn and Jake ever crossed his path. The visual grammar of his scenes is distinct from anything else in the show's vocabulary. The color palette shifted when he was present. The animation became less fluid. The backgrounds flattened. The score stripped away the warm, quirky elements that characterized the show's usual sound and replaced them with something sparse and cold. Every technical dimension of the production signaled that the Lich occupied a different register than everything else in the world he moved through, that a scene containing him was operating under different rules than a scene without him. He is also the show's most direct articulation of what the Mushroom War produced beyond physical destruction. The Lich did not arrive from outside the world's history. He grew from the war the way Princess Bubblegum's kingdom grew from nuclear contamination, an authentic product of what humanity did to itself, a consciousness assembled from the energy of mass destruction and given 1,000 years to develop purpose. Every adventure Finn and Jake went on in the cheerful landscape of Ooo was happening in the shadow of that, whether the show said so explicitly or not. He changed what the show was willing to contain, and everything that came after him, every piece of genuine darkness the show committed to across its remaining seasons, was possible because he had established that Adventure Time was a place where something like him could exist without apology. If you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The Lich established that Adventure Time contained something that operated entirely outside its usual warmth, built from the ruins of the old world with nothing soft to offer. What came next was darker in a completely different way. Not a monster, but a man the show had spent 3 seasons teaching you to laugh at. Section 4. Simon Petrikov, the man who became the Ice King. For almost 3 full seasons, the Ice King was a punchline. That is not a complaint. He was a very effective punchline, constructed with enough comedic specificity that his failures landed consistently, and his presence in any given episode reliably produced something worth watching. He kidnapped kidnapped princesses. He wanted to force one into marrying him. His schemes were elaborate, and his execution was poor, and his penguins, collectively named Gunter, waddled after him with the specific loyalty of creatures who have attached themselves to someone for reasons neither party could fully explain. His voice was high and reedy and slightly whining, the voice of a man who believed himself wronged by the universe and wanted everyone around him to know it. He was lonely in a way that the show played for comedy. His loneliness expressed through increasingly absurd attempts to manufacture romantic connection with people who had no interest in providing it. Children watching the show in its early seasons understood the Ice King as the nuisance villain, the recurring obstacle who showed up to complicate things and then failed, and then showed up again the next time the plot required someone to fail in an entertaining way. The show wanted them to think that. It needed them to think that, because what it was building underneath that reading required the comedic surface to be completely convincing before the layer beneath it could be revealed. If the Ice King had seemed suspicious or complicated or in any way tragic from his first appearance, the reveal would have landed differently. It would have felt like a twist the show had been working toward, a planned revelation executed at the right moment. Instead, by the time the show showed its audience who the Ice King actually was, they had spent 2.5 seasons laughing at him. And the laughter, once the truth arrived, became part of the weight. The episode that changed everything was Holly Jolly Secrets, a 2-part Christmas special that aired in December 2011, deep in the show's 3rd season. The premise was constructed as comedy from the ground up. Finn and Jake discover that the Ice King has buried a box of VHS tapes somewhere in the tundra, and they become convinced the tapes contain embarrassing secrets. They dig them up and settle in to watch what they assume will be revealing and humiliating footage. The Ice King discovers what they are doing and attempts to break into their house using increasingly elaborate and holiday-themed schemes, while BMO watches the tapes inside. The tapes turn out to contain hours of the Ice King's personal video diary, which is boring in the specific and particular way that most people's private recordings are boring. Mundane observations and uneventful daily logs, and nothing that would satisfy anyone hoping for genuine revelation. BMO watches with total patience. Finn and Jake grow increasingly frustrated. The comedy of the episode for most of its runtime is the comedy of disappointed expectation, the joke being that the mystery contained nothing worth finding. And then, on the very last tape, everything stops being a joke. A man appears on the screen who does not look like the Ice King. He is dark-haired, olive-skinned, wearing glasses and ordinary clothes. A human man in his 30s or 40s who looks completely and specifically like someone who existed in the world before the Mushroom War. Someone who commuted and worked and had a life with the ordinary texture of lives lived before catastrophe. He identifies himself as Simon Petrikov. He says he is an antiquarian, a collector and studier of ancient artifacts, and he speaks with the measured precision of someone who is accustomed to being careful with information. His voice is recognizable as close to the Ice King's voice, close enough that the connection is immediate and unmistakable, but different in ways that the Ice King's voice never is. There is control in it. There is intelligence operating clearly behind the words. There is the specific quality of a mind that is fully present and fully functional and aware of itself in a way that the Ice King, in his wheedling and his schemes and his oblivious self-pity, never remotely suggested. Simon explains that he purchased a crown from a dock worker in Scandinavia. He bought it as an artifact, the kind of strange and ancient object his profession brought him into contact with regularly, and he put it on as a joke for his fiancée. Her name was Betty. He called her his princess. He does not know what happened while he wore the crown. He only knows that when he took it off, Betty was looking at him with an expression he had never seen on her face before, and that she left, and that he has not seen her since. As the tape continues, Simon's appearance begins to change. The camera catches it gradually, the skin lightening, the nose beginning to lengthen, the beard growing thicker and more unkempt, the specific and terrible physical transformation of a man becoming something else, while still being conscious enough to document it. He is recording himself disappearing. He knows it is happening. He keeps talking because he needs someone to know, because he is losing his grip on himself, and the recording is the only way to leave evidence that someone was here before the thing he is becoming took over completely. He asks for forgiveness on the tape. He apologizes to Betty, not for any specific act, but for the general trajectory of what is happening, for becoming something she would not recognize, for losing the ability to be the person she agreed to be with. He speaks with the specific and devastating clarity of someone trying to hold language, while knowing that language is one of the things being taken from them. The words are careful. The sentences are complete. He is still Simon Petrikov while he is recording, still the intelligent and precise man who purchased a crown as an artifact and put it on as a joke. And that presence, that remaining selfhood visible in the construction of every sentence, makes the physical transformation happening across his body as he speaks more difficult to watch than any horror the show had previously attempted. The Ice King watches the tape alongside Finn, Jake, and BMO. He has one response to everything he just saw. He is embarrassed that he used to wear glasses. That is the entirety of his reaction. He watches Simon Petrikov describe losing his mind, watches his own past self documenting a transformation into the creature he now is, watches a man say goodbye to a woman he loved while the crown unmade him, and he feels mild social embarrassment about his previous eyewear. The crown did not simply alter him. It did not leave some layer of Simon underneath that occasionally surfaced. It replaced him so completely that the Ice King can sit in front of the most direct possible evidence of his own original identity and find nothing in it that connects to anything he currently experiences as himself. Simon Petrikov is gone. Not suppressed, not buried under the Ice King's personality. Gone. That gap between who Simon was on the tape and what sat watching it is the most devastating thing the episode accomplishes. And the episode accomplishes it without any dramatic music, without any character stopping to comment on its significance, without the show doing anything to tell the audience how to feel about what they have just seen. It simply shows the tape and then shows the Ice King's response and leaves the space between those two images completely open. Holly Jolly Secrets is a Christmas episode. It aired in December, aimed at children watching holiday programming, structured as a comedy about a funny villain with embarrassing secrets. What it delivered in its last few minutes was one of the quietest and most precisely constructed character revelations in the history of animated television. The show hit it inside a Christmas special. It came after 20 minutes of jokes. The shift in register, from the comedy of frustrated expectation to the specific horror of watching someone realize they have been watching a man disappear, was handled without announcement or fanfare. The episode just turned and kept going and trusted the audience to make the journey with it. The second major expansion of Simon's story arrived in season 4 in an episode called I Remember You that has become, for most people who watched the show closely, the moment it stopped being something they watched casually and became something they felt. The setup is simple on its surface. The Ice King wants Marceline to write a song with him. He comes to her house with papers and notes and a newspaper clipping, materials he wants to use for inspiration. Marceline is reluctant and slightly impatient with him in the way she is often reluctant and impatient with the Ice King. The dynamic between them familiar and slightly tense and never fully explained to the audience at that point in the series. They have a history the show has been hinting at without making explicit, and I Remember You is where that history begins to surface. As the episode progresses, something becomes visible in the papers the Ice King has brought. Among the random notes and clippings is a letter. It is written in old, careful handwriting, the handwriting of someone who was precise with language and knew it. It is addressed to Marceline. It is from Simon Petrikov. He wrote it to her in the years after the Mushroom War, during the period when he was still himself enough to know he was losing himself. And he wrote it to tell her that whatever he became when the crown finished its work was not him, that he was sorry, that he loved her, and that he needed her to know those things before the part of him that knew them was gone. He needed to tell her while he still could, because the window for telling her was closing, and he knew it, and he used the window. Marceline takes the letter, and she turns it into a song. She sings it while the Ice King sits beside her, listening, nodding along, occasionally joining in with musical enthusiasm that is completely disconnected from any understanding of what he is participating in. He is hearing Simon's farewell letter sung back to him by the person it was written for, and he does not know it is his own letter, does not know he wrote those words, does not know who Marceline was to Simon, or who Simon was to him, or what any of what he is hearing actually means. He hums along. He smiles when the melody pleases him. He is present for the most direct possible confrontation with his own lost identity, and he is experiencing it as a pleasant afternoon making music with someone he likes. Marceline is the only person in the room who knows what is actually happening. She knows who Simon was. She knows what the letter says and who wrote it and why. She is performing a man's goodbye to himself, to the person he loved and the person he was, for an audience of the thing he became, and that thing cannot receive what she is offering, because the capacity for receiving it was one of the first things the crown took. The structure of that scene, one person holding the full weight of a shared history, while the other has lost all access to it, is the structural diagram of a specific kind of grief that the show drew with a precision that most adult dramas do not manage. The episode draws explicit and unambiguous parallels to dementia. The Ice King's behavior across I Remember You, and across the series as a whole, his mood swings, his inability to hold consistent memory, his tendency to seek out people he feels some unnamed pull toward without being able to explain or act on what that pull actually is, mirrors the experience of watching someone you love lose themselves to a degenerative neurological condition. He seeks Marceline out because something in whatever remains of his neurological architecture recognizes her as significant without being able to access why. She keeps showing up because some version of Simon is better than no version, and because she made a commitment to this person that the person can no longer know she made. Lev Grossman, the novelist, was interviewed about the Ice King storyline during the show's run, and said that his own father was going through Alzheimer's at the time, and that watching the show's portrayal of a man losing himself to something he could not control and could not reverse was genuinely affecting. That is not a small thing to say about a cartoon that aired in the early afternoon on Cartoon Network. The season 5 episode, Simon and Marcy, filled in the period between the Mushroom War and the present, showing Simon and a young Marceline navigating the post-war ruins together. That episode, which will be addressed more fully in the next section, deepened the tragedy of I Remember You by showing what the relationship between them had actually been. By the time Simon and Marcy aired, the audience understood the Ice King not as a punchline villain who had been revealed to have a sad backstory, but as the total replacement of a person who had been extraordinary. Simon Petrikov was intelligent and precise and loving and brave in the specific way of someone who keeps doing what needs to be done, even when what needs to be done is very hard. He documented his own disappearance so that whoever watched the tape would know someone had been there. He stayed with Marceline in the ruins of the world because she needed someone to stay. He sang the Cheers theme to hold on to himself while the crown did its work, because music was one of the last things the crown could not immediately reach. All of that was Simon. None of it survived into the Ice King, except in the form of the ghost of it, present in the Ice King's behavior as an unidentifiable pull toward things he cannot name and cannot reach. The Ice King's obsession with finding a princess to marry is the most visible residue of that ghost. He called Betty his princess. He lost her because of the crown. The crown replaced his mind with something that retained no conscious memory of Betty or of what she meant, but kept the shape of the wanting, the specific orientation toward a princess, a woman he could call his own, without retaining any understanding of where that orientation came from or what it was originally reaching for. The Ice King chases princesses because Simon loved one, and that is all that is left of Simon's love, a direction without a destination, a reach without an understanding of what it is reaching for. He will never find what he is looking for by kidnapping anyone. The thing he is looking for no longer exists in any form he could encounter. He is chasing the shape of something he cannot remember losing, in a world that has moved on from the one where it existed, for as long as he continues to exist. The show built all of this across 3 seasons of treating him as a joke. That patience is the most technically impressive aspect of Simon Petrikov's story. The comedy of the early seasons was not a mistake or a misdirection in the negative sense. It was load-bearing. It established the Ice King so thoroughly as a figure of comedy that the reveal of Simon underneath him landed with a force it could not have had if the show had signaled the tragedy earlier. The audience laughed at the Ice King across 2.5 seasons, and then the show showed them who they had been laughing at, and the laughter became something that sat uncomfortably alongside everything that came after it. That discomfort was the point. That discomfort was the show being honest about how tragedy and comedy occupy the same space, how the things we find easiest to laugh at are sometimes the things carrying the most weight, how the punchline and the grief can be the same thing depending entirely on what you know about where it came from. If you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Simon's story showed how completely a person could be erased by the thing that consumed them, and what it cost the people left behind who still remembered who he had been. The episode that brought that cost into its fullest and most devastating focus is where the next section begins. Section 5. Simon and Marcy, 2 survivors in the ruins. There is a specific kind of story that takes place not during a catastrophe, and not in the years when something new has begun to grow from the wreckage, but in the middle stretch, the days and weeks and months immediately after, when everything that organized life around a set of reliable assumptions has stopped and nothing has replaced it yet. That stretch is the hardest to depict honestly, because it has no narrative arc. There is no villain to defeat in the traditional sense, and no moment where the situation decisively improves, and no forward movement that feels like progress rather than simply continued survival. There is only the task of getting through each day with whatever remains available, in a world that has stopped making sense, next to whoever else happens to still be alive. Simon and Marcy, the 14th episode of Adventure Time's 5th season, is set entirely inside that stretch. It takes place 996 years before the events of the main series, in the ruins of a city that was recently a city and is now the empty shell of one. Simon Petrikov, already partially transformed by the crown into something between the man he was and the Ice King he is becoming, is moving through those ruins with a small child named Marceline. She has a fever. He is trying to find her chicken soup. That is the complete premise of the episode. A man looking for soup for a sick child in a destroyed world. The show does not dress it up beyond that. It does not give the premise additional stakes or complications, or a villain beyond the general condition of the world they are moving through. A man, a child, a fever, soup. The simplicity is the point. The Adventure Time writing team, when pitching this episode to Cartoon Network's network executives, described it with a single reference. They called it The Road, except for kids. The Road is Cormac McCarthy's novel and the subsequent film, a piece of storytelling built around a father and his young son moving through a world where all life has essentially ended, where the forward motion of the narrative is not toward resolution, but simply toward the next day, and the day after that, and whatever those days contain. It is relentlessly bleak in a way that is not nihilistic, but is instead deeply honest about what survival actually actually costs when the conditions for survival have been almost entirely removed. The Adventure Time writers used that as their model for a children's cartoon episode, not because they wanted to make children feel hopeless, but because they were committed to depicting the post-war world with genuine honesty. And genuine honesty about that world required the specific tonal register of the road, rather than anything softer. Cartoon Network pushed back during development. The network's primary concern was the object of Simon's search. In earlier versions of the script, Simon was looking for medicine. Marceline's fever was serious, and the ruins of the city offered almost no pharmaceutical resources. And the unavailability of medicine in a world that had recently been destroyed was the specific texture the writers were going for. The network determined that a child being sick in a post-apocalyptic world with no access to medicine was too dark a concept for the show's audience. The writers changed the object of the search to soup. Simon spent the episode looking for chicken soup instead of antibiotics. The bones of the story remained completely intact. A small child was still sick in the ruins of a world that had recently ended. The only adult responsible for her was still a man actively losing his mind to something he could not stop. The resources that would allow him to care for her properly were still nearly impossible to find. The surface object of the search became something warmer, and the rest of the premise stayed exactly where it was, and the network accepted it, and the episode aired. The world depicted in Simon and Marcy is the most direct visual representation of the Mushroom War's aftermath that the show ever committed to. The art direction for those sequences was built around a specific and deliberate contrast with the visual language the show used for the present-day land of Ooo. Ooo is saturated. Its colors are dense and vivid and slightly unreal in the way of a world that has had 1,000 years to become something stranger and more vibrant than what preceded it. The post-war city that Simon and Marceline move through is drained. The palette is dusty and gray adjacent, muted in a way that communicates before any dialogue that this is a different and harder place than the one the audience spends most of their time inside. Buildings stand partially, their shapes recognizable as the kind of structures the audience would know from the world they live in, cracked and hollowed, and preserved through inertia rather than through any continued purpose. Streets that were designed for cars and pedestrians and the general busy movement of a populated city are completely still. The stillness is its own form of horror, not the horror of destruction, which has a specific visual grammar that the mind can process and categorize, but the horror of absence, of a space built to contain human life from which human life has been almost entirely removed. Simon finds a motorcycle at one point in the episode and attempts to use it to move faster through the city. He and Marceline crash immediately. He finds an office chair with wheels on it and pushes her through the empty streets instead, moving at walking pace through infrastructure designed for speed, using the remnant of an office environment to serve a function it was never designed for, because it is what is available and he needs something. The image of a man pushing a sick child through a destroyed city in an office chair is simultaneously absurd and tender, and quietly one of the most economical pieces of visual storytelling the show ever produced. It communicates his resourcefulness and his love and the genuine poverty of his circumstances in a single sustained image, without requiring any dialogue to do the work. He is using what is left. He is doing the best he can with what the world has left him. That combination of love and improvisation and the specific indignity of the situation is the show's most fundamental emotional register, stated in its purest possible form. The campfire scene that precedes the trip into the city is the episode's most concentrated piece of writing. Simon finds a broken television set in the ruins, a dead screen with no power and no connection to anything, and he holds it up in front of his face and performs an episode of Cheers through it for Marceline. He does the characters. He does the voices. He uses the dead frame of a broken television as a stage for a sitcom that no longer has any infrastructure to broadcast it, performing it from memory for a 7-year-old girl who needs something to laugh at. Marceline taps an old soda can and says mute, and Simon mouths words in silence while she watches him. She laughs. That moment, a man using the skeleton of a consumer appliance to perform network television for a child in the ruins of the civilization that produced both, is the show saying something with a single image that most television achieves laboriously across entire seasons, if it achieves it at all. He is keeping something alive that has no practical reason to still exist. He is doing it because she needs it to. That is what love does in the aftermath of things. The Cheers connection runs deeper than a single campfire scene. Later in the episode, when Simon is surrounded by the mutant slime creatures that have been following them through the city and needs to use the crown to fight them off, he sings the Cheers theme to himself while the crown does its work. He sings it as an anchor, a piece of the world he recognizes from before the war, a melody connected to a sitcom about a bar in Boston where everybody knows your name, and he uses it to hold on to who he is, while the crown reaches into his mind and replaces pieces of it with something colder. The song is about belonging. It is about showing up somewhere and being recognized and welcomed and known. Simon sings it to prevent himself from losing the capacity to recognize anyone, including the child standing beside him, and the gap between what the song is about and what he is using it for, is the kind of gap that the show opened without commentary and then simply left open, trusting the audience to feel what lived inside it. When the fight is over and he takes the crown off, his beard does not shrink back the way it did before. The transformation has progressed. The crown kept a little more of him this time. The show charts this deterioration across the episode through specific physical markers: the beard, the skin tone, the shape of the nose, the quality of the eyes, and does so without underlining each change or drawing the audience's attention to it explicitly. The changes accumulate quietly, the way the crown's damage accumulates quietly, and by the end of the episode, the man who started it and the man who ends it are visibly different, in ways that point clearly and without comfort toward where this is going. Marceline in the episode is approximately 7 years old, based on the timeline the show establishes. She is small and sick, and she does not entirely understand what is happening to Simon, but she understands enough. The show gives her an expression when Simon puts on the crown that is one of the most precise pieces of character animation in the series. It is not fear exactly, not the wide-eyed alarm of a child encountering something frightening for the first time. It is something closer to braced recognition, the face of a child who has seen this before and does not like what it leads to and is making herself ready for it anyway. She has started to understand the pattern. She does not have language for what she understands, but the understanding is present in her face every time the crown goes on, and the show lets that be visible without drawing attention to it. At one point, Marceline makes Simon promise he will not use the crown again. He promises. He means it when he says it. And then the creatures come back and there is nothing else available, and he uses it again. And afterward, he holds her and tells her he loves her. He calls her Gunter, just once, briefly, before he corrects himself. Gunter is the name he will eventually give all of his penguins in the 1,000 years that follow, the collective name for the creatures who become his companions after the world has finished taking everyone else. The name is close enough to Marceline's name to be unmistakably connected to it, close enough to suggest that when the crown finished its work and the Ice King was all that remained, the ghost of her stayed inside him, surfacing in the wrong form, attached to the wrong thing, close enough to write that it only made the wrongness more apparent. He could not remember her name. He could not remember who she was. He could not access any of what they had been to each other in the ruins of the city where he pushed her through empty streets in an office chair. But the shape of the word stayed. Gunter, close enough to reach for and too far to hold. The episode contains a detail that arrives so quietly that it passes without announcement and requires subsequent episodes to fully illuminate. After the fight with the creatures, after the empty soup shop, after Simon and Marceline have been through most of what the episode puts them through, a pink substance clinging to the side of a building drops a can of chicken soup and a can opener down to Simon. The substance has a faint suggestion of a face. It is gentle and seemingly deliberate in its offering. Simon takes the soup and says nothing about what provided it. The show does not pause to explain what the pink substance is. Viewers who followed the lore carefully across subsequent seasons came to understand it as the Mother Gum, the proto-organism from which Princess Bubblegum and the entire Candy Kingdom eventually developed, the biological foundation of the brightest and most cheerful location in the show's present-day world. The future of Ooo is already forming in the rubble. It is watching a man take care of a child. It is offering what it has. The kingdom that will one day be built above irradiated waste is beginning its existence by helping Simon find soup for Marceline, and the show places that detail in the episode without comment and keeps moving, leaving it for whoever is paying close enough attention to find. The episode's time cards, which announce the flashback with the phrase, "On this day 996 years ago," were deliberately styled after the text transitions used in the zombie films 28 Days Later and 28 Weeks Later. These are films about worlds that have lost the capacity to sustain normal human life, where survival is contingent and most of what previously existed no longer does. The production team was choosing references with full awareness of what they were doing. They were placing a children's cartoon in direct conversation with the bleakest registers of post-apocalyptic fiction, and they were doing it because they believed the combination of familiar and beloved characters with genuinely harsh circumstances would produce something that neither register could produce independently. The warmth that Finn and Jake's adventures had built across 4.5 seasons was available to Simon and Marcy as a foundation. The show was borrowing against that warmth to make the episode's harder moments land harder than they would have in a work that had not established that foundation first. Rebecca Sugar wrote Simon and Marcy. It was the last episode she worked on for Adventure Time before leaving the show to develop Steven Universe. She left behind, as her final contribution to the series, that had helped define the early part of her career, one of the most emotionally complete things the show ever produced. The episode functions as a self-contained piece of storytelling that rewards viewers who know nothing beyond what it contains, and it functions simultaneously as the deepest excavation of the show's central tragedy for viewers who had been following Simon's story since Holly Jolly Secrets. Both of those things are true at once. The episode holds them without strain. What Simon and Marcy accomplished for the show's overall overall architecture was to make the post-apocalyptic world tangible in a way that atmospheric background details and scattered lore fragments could only point toward. The Mushroom War had been present in the show's landscape for years before this episode aired. The ruins were there, the buried vehicles were there, the businessmen in the iceberg had been there since season 1. But all of that was history, and history has a specific kind of distance built into it. The distance between knowing something happened and feeling what it was like to be inside it. Simon and Marcy removed that distance. It put two characters the audience cared about inside the wreckage and followed them through a single day of trying to survive in it. And in doing so, made the abstract history of the Mushroom War into something with a specific temperature and texture and emotional weight that all the background ruins in the world could not have manufactured on their own. From that point forward in the series, the bright ooh that the show spent most of its time inside carried something different. Not heavier exactly, not in a way that made the cheerful episodes feel dishonest or the comedy feel inappropriate. Something more like depth. The distance between the campfire where Simon performed cheers for a sick child and the Candy Kingdom where Princess Bubblegum ruled over cheerful citizens made of sweets was not a large distance in geographic terms. In every other sense, it was everything. The show had shown both things. It had earned the right to hold them simultaneously. And the audience that had watched Simon push Marceline through empty streets in an office chair would never quite be able to look at the bright candy world that grew from those ruins without feeling, in some quiet and persistent way, the ground it was standing on. If you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Simon and Marcy made the ruins personal, and everything Marceline carried out of them she carried alone for 1,000 years. And that weight is where the next section begins. Section 6. Marceline, 1,000 years of carrying it. Marceline the Vampire Queen arrived in Adventure Time's first season as something close to an antagonist. She appeared at Finn and Jake's treehouse, informed them that it was her house, and had been for longer than they had been alive, and evicted them without much ceremony or apparent guilt about it. The show framed her early appearances through the lens of mystique and mild threat. She was powerful and old, and she was not going to explain herself to anyone. And that combination of power and opacity made her a compelling presence, even in episodes that did not give her much to do beyond being an obstacle or a complication. She floated. She played bass guitar made from a family heirloom battle axe. She ate the color red rather than food in the conventional sense. She was strange in the specific way of someone who had been alive long enough to stop worrying about whether their strangeness was legible to others. What the show was doing with Marceline from the very beginning, across all of those early appearances that leaned into the mystique and the mild menace, was building a character whose surface behavior was a precise and practiced response to everything she had already lost. The attitude was not who she was. The attitude was what she had built to keep moving after accumulating losses that would have stopped most people entirely. She had been alive for approximately 1,000 years by the time Finn and Jake met her, and the show assembled the history of those 1,000 years across seasons in fragments, non-linearly, each piece arriving in a different episode and a different context, building toward a portrait of someone who had been shaped by loss so thoroughly and for so long that the shaping had become invisible even to people paying close attention. Her history begins before the Mushroom War. She was born to a human mother named Elise and a demon father named Hunson Abadir, the ruler of the Nightosphere, a dimension the show depicts as a kind of chaotic underworld sustained by the consumption of souls. Her father was absent for most of her early life, in the specific way of a parent whose nature and priorities made consistent presence genuinely difficult rather than simply inconvenient. Her mother Elise is shown in later episodes to have survived the Mushroom War's immediate devastation, but not for long. The show implies with the specificity of something it wants the audience to understand, without stating directly, that Elise died of radiation sickness, the slow and particular consequence of nuclear fallout on a human body, without access to the medical resources that might have extended her life. Marceline believed for a long time that her mother had abandoned her. The later revelation that Elise had instead simply run out of time, that the leaving had been dying rather than choosing to go, mattered enormously to Marceline, in a way the show handled with the quiet, emotional care it brought to all of her arc's most significant moments. The distinction between being left and being lost is one of the most psychologically precise things the show ever drew. After Elise, there was Simon. He was the closest thing to stable ground she had in the most unstable period imaginable, a small child and a partially transformed man navigating the post-war ruins together, pushing through empty city streets and office chairs, performing cheers by a campfire, using whatever was available to make something that resembled safety out of circumstances that offered almost none. And then Simon left too, not because he wanted to, but because the crown was winning, and whatever he was becoming was not safe to keep near a child. He left to protect her. He wrote her a letter explaining this, the letter that surfaces 1,000 years later in the episode, I Remember You. And then he went, and Marceline was left alone in the ruins of a world that had already taken her mother, now also without the person who had become her anchor in the aftermath. aftermath. She was somewhere around 7 years old when Simon left. She would live for approximately 993 more years before the events of the main series began. The show does not depict most of those years directly. It gives fragments. It gives the outline of a shape rather than filling the shape in completely. And the outline is enough because the shape it traces is recognizable as the shape of someone who kept going for a very long time in conditions that did not make keeping going easy, and who developed, across those centuries, a specific relationship to loss that informed every aspect of how she moved through the world by the time Finn and Jake met her. Her father reappeared periodically across those centuries. The relationship between Marceline and Hunson Abadir is one of the show's most carefully constructed emotional dynamics, and the episode, It Came from the Nightosphere, from the show's second season, contains what is probably the most compressed and honest expression of that dynamic in the series. Marceline confronts her father with a song she wrote about her feelings toward him. The song is called Fry Song, and its lyrics are specific and unguarded in a way that Marceline's dialogue almost never is. A direct statement of what it felt like to grow up with a father who was not there, and who, when he was there, tended to treat the world as a resource, rather than a collection of things worth caring about. The episode frames the confrontation partially as comedy, because Hunson's demonic nature and his oblivious self-centeredness lend themselves to jokes, but the comedy does not swallow the feeling. The song lands through the joke rather than being obscured by it, which was the show's most consistent technical achievement, finding the place where something could be funny and genuinely felt simultaneously, and staying inside both registers at once. Marceline hunted vampires at some point in the centuries between the Mushroom War and the present. The 7th season miniseries Stakes is where the show devoted its most sustained attention to this period of her life, and what it revealed was that she did not hunt vampires out of bloodlust or the desire for power, or any motivation that would make her seem straightforwardly heroic in the conventional sense. She hunted them because she had found a group of surviving humans, small and vulnerable, and completely without the means to protect themselves, and the vampires were killing them. She put herself between the surviving humans and the things that wanted to kill them, repeatedly, across an extended period, because someone needed to, and she was capable of it. In doing so, she absorbed the essence of each vampire she defeated, gaining their powers and their immortality through the process of protecting people who could not protect themselves. She was bitten by the Vampire King during this period, and the bite completed the transformation. She became immortal, not as a reward, as a consequence of refusing to stop doing something necessary regardless of what it cost her. Immortality in Adventure Time is never depicted as a gift. The show is too honest about what living for a very long time actually means to frame extended life as anything other than an ongoing condition that must be navigated rather than a prize to be enjoyed. Marceline could not age. She could not change in the way that human beings change, through time and the gradual softening of old grief as new attachments formed to partially fill the spaces left by the ones that ended. She was 1,000 years old and physically somewhere between a teenager and a young adult, because that is when the transformation stopped the clock on her body, and she had been accumulating losses for all of those centuries without the biological process of aging that normally paces those accumulations and eventually ends them. Every human friend she ever made grew old and died while she stayed the same. Every place she loved long enough changed around her until it was no longer recognizable as what she had loved. The world she was born into ended, and something stranger and more colorful grew in its place, and she moved through that new world carrying everything the old one had contained, because there was nowhere to put it down. The pattern of how she moved through the world reflects this in ways the show established early and never abandoned. She did not stay anywhere for long. She moved from cave to house to treehouse to cave again across the centuries, never fully settling, never allowing any single location to become something she would grieve the loss of before she had already prepared to leave it. The show frames this initially as antagonism. She evicts Finn and Jake from their treehouse in her first appearance and claims it as her own, but later seasons reframe it entirely. She had carved her name in that treehouse years before Finn and Jake were born. She had lived there before. She had left. She came back. She left again. The pattern of arriving and departing was not about territory or property or any external reason the show provided. It was the specific way a person moves through the world when staying completely has been proven over and over across a very long time to eventually mean losing completely. She kept one foot out the door not because she did not care about where she was, but because she cared too much and had paid too many times for caring that completely to do it any differently. The music is the place where all of the above lives most honestly. Marceline writes her own songs and plays bass guitar from her family's heirloom battle axe, and the songs she writes across the series are consistently the most direct and unguarded access to her interior life that the show provides. Her dialogue tends toward guardedness. Her behavior tends toward the playful or the prickly, the two registers of a person who has learned to stay mobile emotionally because stillness means vulnerability. But the music is different. The music is the part of her that did not build walls around itself, that stayed open when everything else in her learned to stay closed, that kept offering itself honestly to whoever was present to receive it, even when the rest of her was not. The episode What Was Missing, from the show's third season, contains a song Marceline sings that strips away the usual armor and says directly to Princess Bubblegum that she misses her, and that what they had was real, and that the loss of it cost something. The show had been building toward that statement for episodes without landing on it, circling around something that both characters seemed to know, and neither seemed able to approach directly. The song arrived as the most honest thing Marceline had said to Bubblegum in the entire series up to that point, delivered through music because music was the channel through which she could say true things that her usual manner of navigating the world would not allow. The show built around that moment for seasons afterward, letting the admission sit in the air between the two characters without resolving it, which is exactly how people who have hurt each other and have not figured out what to do about it actually behave. They circle. They find reasons to be in the same room without finding the words for the actual thing. Marceline had been doing that with Bubblegum for decades before Finn and Jake arrived, and the show understood that depicting it honestly meant depicting it slowly, at the pace that grief and unresolved feeling actually operate. The I Remember You episode, which revealed the full significance of her relationship with Simon and the letter he wrote before the crown finished its work, is the episode where the show made the structure of what Marceline had been carrying for 1,000 years fully visible. She took Simon's farewell letter and turned it into a song while the Ice King sat beside her, nodding along, occasionally trying to harmonize with the enthusiasm of someone who has no idea what they are participating in. She was performing a man's goodbye to himself for an audience of the thing he became, singing his words back to him with full knowledge of what they were and who wrote them and why, while he smiled and swayed gently to the melody. The song was addressed to her. She was singing it to the person it was about. He could not receive it. She knew he could not receive it. She sang it anyway, because the letter existed, and the feeling existed, and music was the only channel left through which any of it could move. The Stakes miniseries in Season 7 is where the show devoted an entire arc to examining what Marceline carried and what it would mean to try to put some of it down. The premise was built around her wanting to be cured of her vampirism, wanting to shed the immortality that had become both a protection and a sentence. Princess Bubblegum had developed a machine capable of extracting her vampire essence, making her mortal again, returning her to the biological trajectory of a life that moved forward and eventually ended, rather than one that simply continued indefinitely. Marceline went through with it. For a brief period, she was mortal, aging, vulnerable in the way she had not been for centuries. The show did not reward her for the decision in any straightforward sense. The vampires whose essences she had absorbed were reborn when her vampirism was extracted, and she had to fight and reabsorb each of them to stop them from destroying the humans of Ooo. At the end of the arc, she was a vampire again. What that arc communicated about grief and trauma and the things a person carries that cannot simply be removed and disposed of is more sophisticated than most animated shows attempt. Marceline could not extract what had happened to her and start fresh, as though none of it had occurred. The things that made her what she was could not be separated out and left behind without consequence. They had to be confronted directly, engaged with honestly, and then reabsorbed consciously, carried forward with full awareness, rather than as the background condition of an existence that had simply accumulated them over centuries. The Stakes miniseries was about choosing, with full knowledge of what the choice cost, to continue carrying what could not be put down, because putting it down would mean becoming something that could not protect the people she loved. That is not a simple or comfortable conclusion for a children's animated series to arrive at. The show arrived at it anyway, without apology and without softening the cost. Her relationship with Princess Bubblegum finally achieved the full visibility the show had been building toward across the series finale, when the two of them acknowledged, without the elaborate indirection that had characterized their dynamic for years, what they were to each other. The moment was not made into a spectacle. It arrived simply, and then the show kept moving, which was exactly right, because Marceline had spent 1,000 years moving toward things she loved in the specific way of someone who had learned to keep moving, regardless of what the moving cost. Stillness had never been available to her. The show understood that about her from the beginning and honored it in the ending. What makes Marceline the emotional center of Adventure Time's darkness is not any single episode or any single revelation. It is the accumulation, 1,000 years of specific and clearly described loss, assembled across the show's run in pieces that arrived in different contexts and registered with different weights, building toward a portrait of someone who had survived things that should not be survivable and kept moving because moving was what she knew how to do. The bass guitar made from the battle axe was not an aesthetic choice. It was the mechanism through which she survived her own interior life. The music was where everything she could not say went, everything she could not put down and could not carry quietly and could not resolve. Given form and melody and played alone in the cave in whatever hours of the night she needed it most. Without the music, there would have been been nowhere for any of it to go. With it, she kept going. Across 1,000 years of loss, in a world that kept changing around her while she stayed the same, she kept going. If you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Marceline carried 1,000 years of loss through music and through the specific discipline of never fully stopping. And the man who built the show that contained her did something similar when the weight of running it became too much, stepping back quietly and handing what he had made to someone willing to follow it into its own darkness. Section 7. Pendleton Ward steps back, and what the show became. Adventure Time was reaching 14 million viewers a week at the height of its popularity. That number, cited in interviews and network reports from around 2014, gives some sense of the scale of what Pendleton Ward was managing every day when he was the public-facing authority on the show he had built from a short film he made in his 20s into one of the most watched cartoons on American television. The creative work, the writing and the drawing, and the specific imaginative labor of building a world out of his own private sensibility was the work he was suited for and the work he loved. The rest of it, the meetings and the network negotiations and the merchandise oversight and the daily administrative reality of being the person whose name and creative identity were attached to a property that had grown far beyond anything a single person could comfortably contain, was something else entirely. It was the kind of work that a person who had grown up awkward and isolated and who had found his people finally at animation school and built a show essentially out of his own internal landscape was not naturally equipped to sustain across years without significant personal cost. Sometime during the production of the 5th season, quietly and without any public announcement or dramatic departure, Pendleton Ward stopped being the showrunner of Adventure Time. He did not leave the show. He continued writing and storyboarding. He remained an executive producer with genuine creative involvement, but the responsibility of running the production, of being the person whose decisions shaped the overall direction of everything, passed to Adam Muto, his classmate from Cal Arts, and one of the closest collaborators he had from the earliest days of the series. Muto had been there from the beginning in a real sense, storyboarding episodes in the first season, writing key scenes across the middle seasons, working alongside Rebecca Sugar on some of the show's most emotionally significant early lore episodes, and being promoted progressively through the production hierarchy until he was already doing much of the substantive work that a showrunner does before the title was formally transferred. The transition was not abrupt in the operational sense. In the creative sense, it was significant. Ward spoke about the departure publicly for the first time in a Rolling Stone interview published in October 2014, and what he said about it was not sad and not frustrated, and not the expression of someone who had been pushed out of something he wanted to keep. He described it with something close to relief, the specific lightness of a person who has made a decision that was genuinely right for them, even if it came at a real cost. He said that having quality of life outweighed the need to control the project and make it great all the time. He said that dealing with people every day wore on him in ways that were not sustainable. He said he quit because it was driving him nuts. He said this cheerfully, with the matter-of-fact tone of someone who had taken their own psychological needs seriously and acted on them, rather than continuing to grind through circumstances that were making them unhappy for the sake of maintaining control over something they had built. He was not disowning the show. He was stepping back from the part of it that was costing him more than he had to give. What is worth staying with about Ward's own self-description is how precisely it maps onto the sensibility of the show he made. He called himself a fan of ambivalent emotions, of feeling happy and scared at the same time, of the specific texture of experiences that contain contradictory feelings simultaneously. He described Adventure Time as a dark comedy. He said he loved whimsy and silliness, but was also, in his own words, constantly thinking about how death is always looming. He was a person who carried genuine heaviness and chose to express it through bright colors and silly jokes and a stretchy magic dog. And when the machinery of running a massive production made it impossible to keep doing that, when the overhead of the operation consumed the creative space the operation was supposed to protect, the work stopped being sustainable. He made a quiet decision for his own sanity and handed the show to someone else and went back to doing the parts of it he was built for. Adam Muto was the right person to inherit it, and not simply because he was available or because he had been there from the beginning, but because he had been shaped by the same creative environment and understood the tonal balance Ward had established between the show's lightness and its weight. He had been the writer or co-writer on some of the show's most emotionally complex episodes. He had been in the room for the development of the lore that would come to define the series. He understood what the show was reaching for, and he had the specific disposition to follow it there without needing to protect himself from it the way Ward had occasionally needed to, by keeping the darkness in the background rather than letting it surface too fully into the foreground. But Muto was a different person with different instincts, and those instincts became visible in the episodes produced under his leadership in ways that were real and measurable, and that changed the texture of what the show was doing. The shift began to be noticeable in the second half of Season 5, which Muto took over partway through, dedicating Dedicated viewers who had followed the show closely began registering something different in the episodes from that period onward. The comedy was still present, the strangeness was still there. The fundamental warmth that Ward had built into the show's DNA remained, but the emotional ambiguity was higher. The episodes were more willing to sit inside difficult feelings without providing the resolution toward lightness that Ward's era had generally moved toward before the credits rolled. The show was still funny, but the funny was sitting alongside things that were harder, and that the show was less interested in softening or redirecting before the episode ended. Season 6 was the first full season produced under Muto's leadership, and it remains the most debated season in the show's history. There are viewers who found it too slow, too disconnected from the adventure-forward energy that had defined the earlier years, too interested in difficult questions at the expense of the accessibility that had made the show so widely beloved. There are viewers who consider it the most ambitious thing the show ever attempted, the season where it most fully trusted its audience to follow it somewhere genuinely difficult, without the reassurance of consistent lightness. Both responses have something real in them. Season 6 is a season of Adventure Time that is deeply interested in questions that do not have comfortable answers. What does it mean to find purpose when the framework that organized your sense of purpose turns out to be less stable than you believed? How does a person move through the world when the things they used to anchor themselves to are gone? What do you do with grief and anger that has nowhere productive to go? These are not light questions, and the show addressed them through Finn's arc across the season in a way that was heavier and more sustained and less resolved than anything Ward's era had committed to maintaining across an entire season. The tonal shift under Muto is not simply that the show became darker. That framing misses the precision of what actually changed. Ward's Adventure Time was dark in the way a deep lake is dark, the surface bright and accessible and genuinely enjoyable on those terms. The darkness present below but not intruding, available to whoever chose to look down, but not rising to meet people who did not. Muto's Adventure Time began letting the depth surface more regularly. The episodes under his leadership were more likely to stay in the complexity, rather than resolving toward lightness. Characters made decisions that were difficult to watch, and were not redeemed or corrected before the episode ended. Outcomes were less reliably positive. The show began spending more time below the surface it had maintained so carefully across its first 4.5 seasons, and it spent that time with a patience and a seriousness that the earlier seasons had generally reserved for individual moments, rather than sustained across entire episodes and arcs. One of the most significant structural changes that happened under Muto's leadership, and which Cartoon Network itself was initially resistant to, was the shift toward serialized storytelling. Ward's era operated largely episodically. Each episode mostly stood alone. There were threads of continuity, especially in the lore-heavy episodes that Sugar and Muto himself had contributed, but the show's default mode was the self-contained adventure, the problem that arrived and was addressed within 11 minutes and left the characters in approximately the position they had been in before it arrived. Under Muto, the push toward serialization became explicit and sustained. Episodes began building on each other in ways that required viewers to have been following the continuous narrative, rather than dropping in at any convenient point. The network was resistant to this initially, per Muto's own account in subsequent interviews, and eventually accepted it partly because serialized episodes could be packaged together in groups for promotional and scheduling purposes. Whatever the network's reasoning for accepting it, the creative consequence was a show that began developing long story arcs with consequences that did not reset between installments. Severity is what allowed the show's darkness to accumulate in the way it did across the later seasons. When each episode is self-contained, the emotional weight of any given scene is bounded by the episode that contains it. The grief ends when the credits roll. The problem is solved, or the character is reset to a position close enough to where they started that the next episode can begin fresh. Serialization meant that the grief could carry forward. Finn's loss of his arm in the Season 5 finale carried into Season 6, not as a resolved wound, but as an ongoing one, present across multiple episodes, visible in his behavior, shaping his choices, changing how he moved through the world in ways that did not disappear when the immediate crisis passed. His depression in Season 6, addressed explicitly in episodes like The Tower and Breezy, was not fixed in a single episode and then forgotten. It persisted. It was present in the texture of his daily experience across multiple installments, treated as the genuine ongoing condition that depression actually is, rather than as a plot obstacle to be cleared before the adventure could resume. Rebecca Sugar's departure from the show also happened in this transitional period, specifically after Simon and Marcy, when she left to develop Steven Universe. Sugar's presence on Adventure Time had been one of the primary creative forces pushing the show toward emotional depth and narrative weight from inside the writer's room. The episodes she contributed to, from the early Marceline stories through I Remember You and Simon and Marcy, were consistently among those that landed hardest emotionally and built the most significant pieces of the show's mythology. Her departure did not collapse the show. Muto and the remaining team team continued the work she and others had started, followed the threads she had helped establish, and developed the lore she had contributed to in directions that honored what she had built. But her absence represented another layer of transition, another sensibility leaving the room, and the show that continued past that point was navigating territory she had helped chart without the specific quality of her voice in the room helping to chart it. What Muto brought to the show that Ward's era had held back, and held back for good reasons connected to what Ward was making and what he was protecting, was a willingness to let things stay broken for longer. Ward's Adventure Time resolved toward lightness, not because the darkness was not real or not present or not serious, but because Ward's instinct was to hold the darkness in the background, to let it be atmospheric and textural and felt, without letting it become the dominant emotional register of any sustained period of the viewing experience. Muto's instinct was different. He was willing to let characters inhabit genuinely difficult emotional states across multiple episodes, without providing the quick resolution that Ward's era had tended toward. He was willing to trust the audience, which had grown alongside the show in some cases for 4 or 5 years by that point, to handle watching people they cared about remain broken for longer than was comfortable. Ward left without drama, because drama was not how he was built. He said his brain needed to be happy. He stepped back from the machine he had built when the machine started costing more than it was returning to him, and he handed it to someone who could run it without that cost. The show he made had always been quietly carrying things, grief and loss, and the weight of a world built on catastrophe, and expressing all of it through candy colors and silly voices and a magic dog who could stretch into any shape the situation required. When he stepped back, the show continued carrying those same things, only with less of the protective cotton wool wrapped around the harder edges, less of the instinct to resolve toward lightness before the viewer had fully felt the weight of whatever the episode had put in front of them. Both versions were Adventure Time. Both were doing something real. The difference was one of degree and of patience. And when the man who invented the thing decided that his quality of life mattered more than controlling it, the degree shifted in ways that made the show's final seasons something different from what its first seasons had been, and something that could not have been what it was without the foundation those first seasons had built. The 14 million viewers who had been watching since the beginning were given a show in its later seasons that required more of them than it had in its first season. More patience, more willingness to sit in discomfort, more trust that the difficulty was going somewhere worth following. Most of them followed. The show that had looked like a silly cartoon about a kid and his magic dog had, by the time Muto was running it fully, become something that did not hide its weight anymore, that let the depth surface and stayed there, that trusted the audience it had spent years building to be ready for what it had always been carrying. If you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The show Muto inherited was one that no longer kept its darkness in the background, and the character who felt that shift most completely was Finn, whose later seasons stripped away every comfortable assumption he had built his identity around and left him to find out what remained. Section 8. Finn grows up, and the world doesn't get kinder. Finn the human was 12 years old when Adventure Time began. The show established this early and treated it as a simple fact, one detail among many in the introduction of a character who seemed straightforward enough on the surface. A boy in a white hat who loved fighting evil and helping people and going on adventures with his best friend. He was earnest in the uncomplicated way of someone who had not yet accumulated enough experience to complicate him. He felt things directly and acted on them directly, and the world of the show's early seasons mostly rewarded that directness, in the way that adventure stories tend to reward their protagonists, with problems that yielded to enthusiasm and courage, and a willingness to hit the threatening thing with a sword until it stopped being threatening. What happened to Finn across 10 seasons is one of the most sustained and honest depictions of growing up that an animated series has ever committed to. And it is honest precisely because the show refused to protect him from the things that growing up actually involves. The girl he loved did not end up with him. The father he had built an entire private mythology around turned out to be someone those mythologies should never have been built around. His body was permanently altered by an event he did not choose and could not have prevented. The world of Ooh did not soften as he got older. It became more complicated, and the complications had real and lasting consequences. And not all of those consequences resolved into anything he could feel good about. Jeremy Shada, who voiced Finn, was 12 years old when he was cast. He underwent puberty during production, and his voice changed noticeably between seasons in ways that could not be hidden, and that Pendleton Ward made the deliberate decision not to try to hide. Ward did not recast him when his voice changed. He let Finn age alongside the actor voicing him, which tied the character's physical and vocal development to the real passage of time in a way that most animated shows avoid entirely because they prefer protagonists who remain conveniently ageless. Finn aged. The character who had a boy's voice in Season 1 had an adolescent's voice by Season 4 and a young man's voice by the later seasons, and the audience that had been watching from the beginning aged alongside him, which was one of the show's most quiet and consequential structural decisions. His first significant romantic arc centered on Princess Bubblegum, bubblegum, and the show handled it with a delicacy that required resisting the narrative convenience of resolution. Finn had a genuine crush on her across the early seasons, and the show acknowledged his feelings without satisfying them, because Princess Bubblegum was always going to be unavailable to him in the ways that mattered. She was centuries older than she appeared. She was preoccupied with the enormous responsibility of ruling a kingdom she had built from scratch. She cared for Finn genuinely, but not in the register he needed her to. That unrequited feeling, carried quietly through the early seasons without being used as a source of comedy or melodrama, was Finn's first sustained experience of wanting something he could not have, and the show let it be genuinely uncomfortable, rather than tidying it into a lesson with clean edges. Then came Flame Princess, introduced in Season 4 as something the show had not previously offered Finn, someone who actually wanted him back. The relationship that developed across Seasons 4 and 5 was given real weight and real time, depicted with the specific earnestness and occasional clumsiness of a teenager navigating genuine romantic feeling for the first time. And then the show broke it, in an episode called Frost and Fire, through Finn's own failure. He wanted something from the relationship, a specific excitement he had found in a dream, and he pursued it without considering what pursuing it would cost the person he was supposed to love. Flame Princess discovered the deception. She ended the relationship. The show did not soften the cause. Finn caused it. He wanted something, moved toward it without thinking clearly about the consequences, and lost her because of it. That is a moral failure depicted with specificity and without the sentimental buffer that most children's animation would have placed around it. The aftermath lasted. He was visibly not okay across multiple episodes. He made poor choices. He tried to feel better through means that did not help and showed no signs of helping. And then in the Season 5 finale, the show layered something else onto the ongoing weight of the breakup, which was the revelation that his biological father was alive and findable, imprisoned in a place called the Crystal Citadel. Finn had spent his life with a private mythology about his father. The show never made this mythology explicit in dialogue, but built its presence into the texture of Finn's behavior, the specific hopefulness that surrounded anything connected to his human origins, the eagerness that arrived with the possibility of finding out where he came from. When Martin Mertens appeared in Escape from the Citadel, the Season 6 premiere, he did not even initially remember that he had a son. He called Finn by the wrong name. He was a con man, imprisoned for crimes committed through manipulation and deception, and he used Finn's desperation for connection with the practiced ease of someone who had been using people's needs against them for his entire adult life. The sequence where Finn lost his arm is the physical expression of what meeting his father actually meant. Martin was escaping the Citadel, and Finn grabbed the platform trying to stop him, trying to hold on to one more moment of possibility, one more chance that his father might yet be something other than what he had shown himself to be. Martin did not stop. The grass sword that had bonded to Finn's arm detached, taking the arm with it, and Finn fell. The show did not cut away. It did not frame the moment in a way that blunted its weight. Finn lost his arm because he held on to his father too long, and his father let him fall. The end of that episode showed Finn at the bottom of a lake, making no effort to swim to the surface. Jake had to pull him out. He had nothing to say. The show gave him no speech and no moment of determined resilience. Just a teenager who went to find his father and came back with one less arm and one less illusion. And the space the show left around that was the most honest thing it could have offered. Season 6 spent significant time inside what that cost him. The tower built an entire episode around Finn constructing a structure into space so he could reach wherever his father had gone and take Martin's arm in exchange for the one he lost. The plan was not heroic. It was revenge fantasy as coping mechanism, the specific occupation that adolescent pain sometimes produces when the actual source of the pain is unreachable. Breezy, arriving a few episodes later, depicted something the show named without flinching, a numbness that had settled over Finn after too many losses too close together. He went to parties and kissed random princesses trying to generate some feeling, any feeling, and found that he could not. He said in the episode that he did not feel anything. The show let that be true for him across multiple installments without rushing toward the fix. What the show was doing with Finn across those seasons was something that went beyond what children's animation typically attempts. It was depicting the layered accumulation of loss, a breakup and a father and an arm, and the collapse of a particular understanding of how the world worked, as a genuine ongoing condition rather than a series of obstacles to be cleared in sequence. Finn was not bouncing back. He was learning, slowly and at real cost, what it means to keep moving when forward does not look like what you expected it to be. The white hat stayed on. The earnestness remained, but the earnestness now carried weight it had not carried in Season 1, because the world of Ooh had not protected him from itself, and the show had not protected him from the world, and both of those refusals were the most honest things the show could have done for a character it had spent years making real enough to deserve honesty. If you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Finn's losses accumulated across seasons without the comfort of a reset, shaping shaping him into someone formed by what the world had actually put in front of him. The show's most ancient evil was undergoing its own transformation across those same seasons, and what it became was the strangest and most quietly hopeful argument Adventure Time ever made. Section 9. The Lich becomes Sweet Pea, and what that means. There is a moment near the end of Escape from the Citadel, the Season 6 premiere, that the show presents almost as an afterthought. The Lich, who began the episode imprisoned in a cosmic jail and spent it spreading gray corruption across a prison containing some of the most dangerous entities in the multiverse, has been accidentally transformed into a large and apparently harmless baby. The transformation happened when Finn's hand, covered in the healing blood of a Citadel Guardian, made inadvertent contact with the Lich's skeletal form. Flesh grew on the bones. A new body assembled itself around the oldest evil in the show's universe. And then, Finn and Jake, not knowing what else to do with a giant infant in a dimension they were trying to escape, left the baby on the doorstep of Tree Trunks and Mr. Pig, a small elephant and her husband who lived quietly outside the Candy Kingdom. Tree Trunks opens the door. She sees the baby. She says that this changes everything. She is right, though not in the way she means. The Lich being reborn as Sweet Pig Trunks, called Sweet Pea, is the most philosophically ambitious thing Adventure Time ever attempted. The premise fits in a single sentence. The most evil entity in the universe was given a new life as an innocent child. Underneath that sentence is a set of questions the show spent multiple seasons sitting with, not always arriving at clean answers, holding the questions with enough care and patience that watching the story develop felt like watching the show think honestly about something it genuinely did not know how to resolve. The first question is the obvious one. If the most destructive thing that exists is given a completely fresh start, a new body with no memory of what it was, raised by people who love it unconditionally, does the original nature survive? Can something defined entirely by its drive toward annihilation become something else? The show does not say yes. It does not say no. It holds the tension across multiple seasons and trusts the audience to sit inside it without demanding resolution. Sweet Pea in his earliest appearances is genuinely sweet. He is large because the Lich's physical scale carried through the transformation, and the show uses his size for gentle comedy, the visual joke of an enormous child navigating a world built for smaller creatures. He helps animals in distress. He is patient and kind and naive in the uncomplicated way of a young child who has not yet encountered enough of the world to become anything except what he has been shown at home. Tree Trunks knits him little shirts. She puts gold stars on the fridge. He goes to school on his first day surrounded by a Candy Kingdom military escort, which says something about how seriously the people of Ooo take the situation, even as they extend genuine warmth to the child himself. The comedy of Sweet Pea's early appearances is real, so is the unease underneath it, because the nightmares are always there. From the beginning of his existence as a character, the show makes clear that whatever the Lich was does not disappear, because the body and the memory were replaced. Sweet Pea wakes screaming. He describes visions that come in the night, a face rising from darkness, a voice that whispers things he does not want to hear. Tree Trunks and Mr. Pig reassure him each time. They tell him it is just a dream, and they believe it, and they are not wrong to believe it, and they are not entirely right either. The thing inside Sweet Pea is the same thing that caused the Mushroom War, that built its body from nuclear detonation, that spent 1,000 years pursuing the extinction of all life. It is there, underneath the little shirts and the gold stars and the genuine sweetness of a child raised well, surfacing in the space between sleep and waking, reaching upward through the layers of a new life toward the surface. The Season 6 episode Gold Stars is where the threat becomes explicit for the first time. Sweet Pea is being targeted and bullied by the King of Ooo and a companion, who exploit his connection to the Lich to frighten and manipulate him. Sweet Pea is distressed in the specific way of a child confronting something he cannot control and does not understand, while the adults who normally protect him are not present. And then, without warning, the Lich surfaces. The King of Ooo and his companion are subjected to visions of darkness and death, delivered in Ron Perlman's voice from a child's body, which is one of the most genuinely unsettling images the show ever produced. Sweet Pea returns to himself immediately after. He does not fully understand what happened. He attributes it, as he attributes everything that frightens him in the night, to a bad dream. The show is making something specific visible through this dynamic. Sweet Pea does not have access to who he was. He cannot recall the Lich's intentions or memories or the scale of what he destroyed. He is genuinely innocent in the way the show needs him to be for its questions to carry weight. Because the question is not whether the Lich deserves a second chance. The question is whether the child who exists in the body where the Lich used to live is the same as the Lich, or whether they are two separate beings sharing a physical form. Sweet Pea has not done anything the Lich did. The memories are not accessible to him. He did not commit a single one of the Lich's crimes, and yet the Lich is still present, waiting, surfacing under extreme emotional stress, trying to reclaim what it considers its own. The Season 9 episode episode, Whispers, brings the confrontation to its most direct expression. A severed hand from an alternate universe version of the Lich has been making its way towards Sweet Pea, and in Whispers, it finds him. The hand whispers to him in the night, telling him he is evil, telling him that destruction is what he is, and what he will inevitably become, telling him that the capacity for ruin inside him is waiting, and that resistance is temporary and pointless. Ron Perlman's voice, delivering those words in the low and genuinely disturbing register it always carried, sounds exactly like what it always was. The voice of something ancient and certain and completely without doubt about what it is and what everything else is. Sweet Pea's response is not heroic in any dramatic sense. He is frightened. He runs from home. He cries in the way a child cries when something has said the worst possible thing about them, in a voice that sounds like it knows the truth. The show takes that fear seriously. It does not shortcut it or resolve it quickly. It lets him be genuinely undone by what the Lich is whispering before arriving at the moment where he must decide what to do with what he carries. The resolution is one of the most quietly excellent moments in the show's final seasons. Sweet Pea, confronting the Lich's hand directly, pretends to accept what it is telling him. He says that he too is Doom. He lets the Lich believe it is one, that the child has finally accepted the identity the Lich always insisted was his true one. And then from within that pretend acceptance he acts, defeats the hand, and says simply that he is not a king of ruin. He calls the Lich a naughty hand. The language is a child's language, deliberately small and gentle, and it deflates the Lich's cosmic self-importance with something more powerful than any argument, which is the complete refusal to take the Lich's framework for reality seriously. The Lich called itself the ceaseless wheel, the inevitable end of all things. Sweet Pea called it a naughty hand and went home. What the Sweet Pea arc says about whether evil is something a person is, or something a person chooses, is more honest than most children's entertainment attempts. The show does not claim that love and a good home removed the darkness from Sweet Pea. It does not claim the Lich inside him is a manageable inconvenience that gold stars and gentle parenting can fully contain. It holds both things simultaneously. Sweet Pea is genuinely good. The Lich is genuinely still there. The question of which one wins is not settled once and answered permanently. It is an ongoing condition, something Sweet Pea has to face and refuse repeatedly, not because the capacity for destruction has been removed, but because he keeps choosing not to become it. Tree Trunks knitting little shirts and putting gold stars on the fridge is not presented as naive or insufficient. It is presented as exactly what it is, which is the best possible thing anyone could do. Not because it eliminates the darkness, but because it builds the person who will have to face the darkness themselves every time it surfaces, for as long as he lives. In the show's finale, Sweet Pea is seen in the far future as a mountain-sized figure wandering the landscape of a changed Ooh, carrying Finn's old sword, enormous and peaceful and not the Lich. The show's most ancient and unconquerable evil became, through seasons of patient storytelling, a giant, gentle child who calls threats naughty hands and refuses to be a king of ruin. If you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Sweet Pea's refusal to become what the Lich insisted he was is the gentlest argument the show ever made, and the finale gathered every thread the series had been carrying and asked what all of it had been for, which is where the last section begins. Section 10. The finale. What Adventure Time was always about. The series finale of Adventure Time is framed as a story being told by someone who was not there. 1,000 years after the events it depicts, BMO sits alone at the top of a mountain and tells two young adventurers named Shermie and Beth what happened to Finn and Jake and everyone they knew. Shermie and Beth have found a mechanical arm in the ruins of a place they do not recognize. They want to know what it is and where it came from. BMO, who has somehow become the king of Ooh in the intervening millennium, tells them. And then the episode goes back, the way the show always went back, to the moment where the story actually lived. This framing device is doing several things simultaneously. It is placing the show's finale inside the tradition of history, of looking backward at what happened long ago and trying to understand it, which was the tradition the show had worked within since its earliest seasons. It is also placing Finn and Jake and everyone they knew inside the category of things that are gone now, things that have to be explained to people who came after, things that are real and finished and permanent in the way that everything eventually becomes permanent. The show began with a world built on the ruins of the one before it. It ended with itself becoming another layer of ruins, another set of stories passed down, another history that the new world walks through without fully knowing what it is standing on. That the finale is told from a distance of 1,000 years is not a gentle choice. Adam Muto, in interviews after the finale aired, said he did not know how happy the ending actually was. The future Ooh glimpsed through Shermie and Beth is not a cheerful place in any straightforward sense. Something has happened again, or several things have happened, and the world has been remade in ways that make it unrecognizable from the Candy Kingdom and the Treehouse and all the locations the show spent a decade building. BMO sits at the top of a mountain in a landscape landscape that looks nothing like anything the audience spent 10 seasons inside. The treehouse is rubble that Shermie has to dig through to find the arm. The show's final image of the future is not of a world that survived its own history intact. It is of a world that kept going after things were lost, the same way Ooh kept going after the Mushroom War, the same way Marceline kept going after everyone she knew was gone, the same way Simon kept singing the Cheers theme while the crown dissolved him from the inside. The episode itself, before the far future framing closes around it, is 44 minutes of the show doing what it had always done, which is packing enormous emotional weight into something that looks on its surface like a fantasy adventure. The Gum War, a conflict building across the later seasons between Princess Bubblegum and her estranged Uncle Gumbald, is resolved not through combat, but through something Marceline does. She reacts to what she believes is Princess Bubblegum's death with the full force of everything she has been carrying for 1,000 years. And in doing so, makes it visible and undeniable to everyone watching that what she feels for Bubblegum has always been exactly what it looked like. The war ends because two people who love each other stop making it harder than it has to be. After years of careful indirection and the slow accumulation of almost statements, Princess Bubblegum and Marceline kiss. The show does not make it a spectacle. It arrives simply, and then the episode keeps moving, which was exactly right. What interrupts everything, and what the finale spends its most serious time addressing, is Golb, an ancient cosmic entity older and more fundamental than the Lich, who identified himself in an earlier episode as the last scholar of Golb. Golb is chaos and entropy and the dissolution of all order, the force that exists before things become things, the condition that precedes all structure and to which all structure eventually returns. Betty Groff, Simon's long-lost fiancée who had returned to Ooh through a time portal in an earlier season, had been attempting to harness Golb's power to undo the crown's damage to Simon. Her plan goes wrong. Golb arrives in Ooh and begins absorbing and dissolving everything it touches. The way Golb is defeated is through music. The characters facing something that dissolves everything that enters it begin singing together, and the harmony is the opposite of what Golb is, which is chaos, and the opposition works. The song they sing is called Time Adventure, written by Rebecca Sugar, who had left the show years earlier to develop Steven Universe and returned specifically to write this piece for the finale. She dedicated it to Adam Muto. The lyrics are about time. They are about how the past is not gone, but permanently real. How nothing that has happened can be reached backward and unmade. How even things that end continue to exist in the past where they occurred. Unchanged and unchangeable. Always happening in the moment they happened in. You and I will always be back then. That is what the song says. The past is the one thing that cannot be taken. The song works on GOLB because harmony is its opposite. That is the show's mechanics. The reason it works on the viewer is because what the song is saying is the show's deepest argument stated plainly. The argument that had been present in every section of lore and every piece of grief and every character shaped by loss across 10 seasons. Adventure Time had always been a show about things that end. About a world that ended and grew something new from the wreckage. About love that outlasted the circumstances it formed inside. About grief that does not resolve, but does not prevent life from continuing. Time Adventure is all of that distilled into a single piece of music, and using it to defeat the most destructive entity in the show's universe is the show saying, in its clearest voice, what it believed about what endures. Simon is briefly restored to himself inside Golb. The entity's process of dissolving everything strips away all the magic acting on him, including the crown's 1,000 years of damage, and Simon Petrikov is present again, in a way the crown had been preventing since before the Mushroom War. He and Betty are together for a few minutes, genuinely, for the first time across the entire run of the show. Betty stays behind when Jake reaches in to pull the others out. She uses the crown, returned to its wish-granting form inside Golb, to make a wish. Her truest wish, the crown takes as its instruction, is to keep Simon safe. She fuses with Golb to send it away from Ooh. She is gone. Simon is free and mortal and alone in a world that has changed completely around him across 1,000 years. Marceline sits with him in the aftermath. She does not tell him it will be all right. She just stays. That is what the show had always said about grief, which is not that it resolves, but that the people who love you remain in the room while you move through it. Fern dies in the finale as well. Fern, a grass version of Finn that had developed its own consciousness and struggled across several seasons with the impossible position of being both Finn and not Finn, finally lets go. The grass curse dissolves. He says goodbye and asks Finn to plant what remains of him at the treehouse. Finn does. A tree grows immediately, enormous, with the Finn sword lodged at its top. The treehouse that served as the show's central location across its entire run is replaced by something that grew from Fern's ending. That is how the show handled death across its whole run. Something grows from where things end. The montage that follows, set to the original closing theme played by the music hole, is the finale's purest expression of what the show had always been about. Not triumph, not resolution, not everyone receiving what they wanted or deserved. Instead, a series of brief and unheard unhurried glimpses at what life looked like for the people of Ooo in the aftermath. Simon begins the long process of trying to find a way back to Betty, or a version of Betty, or some form of the connection he lost again through her sacrifice. Jake and his descendants continue the generous and imperfect love that Jake had always embodied. Princess Bubblegum and Marceline are together in the specific, quiet way of people who have finally stopped making things harder for themselves than they have to be. Sweet Pea wanders the far future as a mountain-sized figure, carrying a sword that once belonged to Finn, enormous and peaceful, and not the Lich. BMO becomes the king of Ooo. Nobody fully explains how. BMO had always existed slightly apart from the main action, self-contained and earnest and present in the margins of adventures, without being central to them. That BMO is the one who survives long enough to tell the story to Shermie and Beth 1,000 years later is either a coincidence of the show's logic or the show's way of saying that what endures is not always what you expect. Shermie and Beth, who serve as the framing device for the entire finale, carry forward what Finn and Jake represented. Shermie is small and eager. Beth is a dog who can change shape. They find the arm and they find the sword, and they set out on something new in a world that has already been broken and rebuilt at least twice. The show does not tell us what happens to them. The point is not the destination of their specific story, but the fact that the pattern continues. That there will always be someone who picks up what the previous generation left behind and starts moving. What Adventure Time was really about, assembled across 10 seasons of Candy Kingdoms and nuclear ruins and dementia and lost arms and ancient evil and a small robot becoming king of everything, is not a complicated idea. Things end. They always end. The world before the Mushroom War ended. Simon Petrikov ended. The treehouse ended. The show itself ended. Everything the characters built and loved and lost is either gone by the finale or will be gone in the 1,000 years that follow. And none of that ending reaches backward and unmakes what was real while it was happening. The love between Simon and Betty was real. The friendship between Finn and Jake was real. The 1,000 years Marceline spent in a world that kept losing things were real. The ending of things does not travel backward through time and remove them. That is what Time Adventure is saying. The past is the one thing that cannot be touched by any force in the universe. Not by the Mushroom War. Not by a cursed crown. Not by the Lich. Not by Golb. What happened, happened. It is always happening. In the past. Permanently. And without the possibility of revision. And that, the show argued across its entire run and stated plainly in its final song, is enough. Not enough in the sense of being painless or satisfying or what anyone would have chosen. Enough in the sense of being real and therefore mattering and therefore being worth everything it costs to carry. The darkness in Adventure Time was never nihilistic. That is the thing that gets lost when people describe the show only through its candy colors, or only through its post-apocalyptic lore, or only through the moments that hit hardest. The darkness was always in service of something, not optimism, which would have been too easy and too dishonest for a show paying this close attention to how things actually go. Something more like durability. The world ended and Ooo grew from it. Simon lost himself and Marceline kept finding him anyway. Finn lost his arm and kept going. The Lich became a child who refused to be a king of ruin. Betty loved Simon so completely that she fused with chaos itself to keep him safe. And even that was not enough to stop the universe from continuing. To stop Shermie and Beth from picking up the sword. To stop the music hole from playing the closing theme one more time. In a landscape that had been broken and remade so many times that breaking and remaking were simply what it did. The show that looked like a silly cartoon about a boy and his magic dog turned out to be, across 8 years and 10 seasons, one of the most sustained and honest meditations on loss and time and the permanence of what was real that animation has ever produced. It did this while being genuinely funny. It did this while being genuinely strange. It did this while hiding its darkest truths inside episodes about chicken soup and holiday specials and a penguin named Gunter. The darkness was always there, running through the bright world the way the irradiated river ran under the Candy Kingdom. Foundational and invisible and completely real. What it made in the end was a show about a world that refused to stop. A world that kept being destroyed and kept growing something new from the destruction. A world where the people who loved each other found ways to stay in the room, even when the room was ruins. A world where 1,000 years of loss could produce, in a child who had been the oldest and most unconquerable evil imaginable, something that called its darkest impulse a naughty hand and refused to become it. That is not a small thing to say, and Adventure Time said it every time it was on, in the language of colors and music and magic and grief, to whoever was paying enough attention to hear it. If you enjoyed this video essay, make sure to subscribe and I'll see you in the next video.